Hello everyone. Hola, ciao, salut. My name is Andrijana. You can call me Andri. It's a pleasure and honor to participate at this amazing event. I'm a huge fan of the Polyglot gathering, multilingualism as a common value we all share. So it's a real pleasure to be part of this community of language enthusiasts. I am a language enthusiast, if you want, a language nerd. I really love etymology and especially language acquisition. My native language is Macedonian, and I specialized in Romance languages, Romance linguistics, mainly French and Portuguese. And I've had the privilege of teaching various languages, French, Portuguese, Macedonian. But recently, I've dedicated my work to teaching my native language, Macedonian, to a wonderful community of heritage learners. And this is how I got inspired to present this talk with you today. This topic is especially dear to me because heritage language learning is a separate, unique form of bilingualism. It's not just any form of bilingualism. Before we dive in, I would like to know if you can tell me what is a heritage language for you. What do you think when I say a heritage language? What comes to mind immediately? Perhaps it's the first time you're hearing this word, or you're maybe familiar with it. Maybe you've just heard about it, or you're a specialist. So I would like to hear your thoughts. What is a heritage? The word heritage is sounds fancy, but we will see the context. So a heritage language. Feel free to share your ideas, and I will share my definition. A heritage language is a language spoken at home, mainly at home, by immigrant families. So there is a difference between a heritage language and a dominant language. So we're talking about bilingual children, especially who grow up with one language at home, within family, and to a very restricted context of learning and of language acquisition, which and this is why their speech tends to be informal, especially at the early stage of acquisition, because the only input they receive is the informal family language, and then there is the dominant language, the language they especially start to acquire when starting school. So education, formal education, work, media. It's the institutional language of the country they live in. So we're talking about families that have two languages. They would either switch. They would switch to the two languages at home, or they would use one language entirely and only at home, and then another language for in work settings or school. This is why the heritage language tends to be informal, because we receive less input, and it's a very limited input, the input that we receive. So when we go outside, we don't hear this language anymore. We can almost visualize this language as my parents' language. And of course, there are several factors. It depends on the community. I've had contact with the Macedonian community, for example, in English-speaking countries such as the United States or Australia. And when we're talking about a Macedonian community, we know that by default it's a small community. So outside of their family, it would be really difficult to find input, and especially even more to find any context to practice. So output. And then you will find communities such as Spanish-speaking communities in the United States, where they would naturally have more input, more opportunities to practice, because we're talking about bigger communities, and more output as well. So the heritage language can be easily lost, especially when the child starts preschool, and the preschool stage, where they would get in contact with the dominant language. The dominant language will replace the primary status of the heritage language. The dominant language would naturally become the primary language. Again, this is because of the quantity and the quality of input, and especially output. A bilingual child would receive. And of course, the dominant language will be the more formal language, the standardized language, a language in which we can express ourselves in more academic, because we've attended school in this language, higher education and work, etc. So I have another question. This talk is not going to be super formal or academic. It's really going to be interactive. So I would love to hear your stories and your questions, ideas. I would like to know if you actively speak a heritage language, and or do you know someone who speaks one at home? We will have some time at the end to read your questions and to discuss together. What is the heritage speaker profile, and why is it different than a second language learner that has no roots or connection to this language, cultural connection? So the heritage speaker tends to have stronger listening and skills and cultural knowledge because of the amount of input they received during early ages. So they would often show comprehension and less production. So comprehension is primary, and then production is what is lacking in these profiles because simply of the lack of practice. And then what also happens is that these heritage speakers tend to like complex grammar. So if we have a heritage language with a very developed verbal system, such as, let's take a Slavic language, let's take Macedonian in my case. It's a language that has a very developed verbal system because it has the aspect, not only tenses, but a perfective and imperfective aspect. People who speak a Slavic language, who are learning a Slavic language, know that this is a feature, a language feature that takes a lot of time to be acquired. What happens with heritage speakers is that they tend to interrupt their language acquisition in a very early age. So at around 7 and 8, depending on when they start school, 6, 7, 8, they would switch. There would be a switch. So the dominant language of society would become their first language. And then this is a very early age of language acquisition, and that's why a language learner would acquire a certain level, which would be upper, beginner, low, intermediate, and they would usually interrupt the language acquisition process here. And this especially happens when this child becomes adult. They leave their parents' home, so their real input and output will be mostly in the dominant language. They would work in with the dominant language, attend school, university, etc. And another phenomenon linguistic that happens is the code switching and interference. This happens to any second language learner, whether it's a heritage speaker or simply someone who wants to learn out of curiosity. The thing with heritage speakers is that when we teach, for example, if you're a teacher, if you teach a heritage speaker, the difference is that you would notice a lot of comprehension and a lot of aha moments. Oh, I knew that. I knew that. I just could not think of it in the moments. And then we will have a lot of code switching, false friends, and then the interference, the transfer, where we would focus on our dominant language to translate directly in order to speak the heritage language. So what is this recessive bilingualism? Bilingualism, you know that meme where you're bilingual when you speak two languages and you keep forgetting words in both of the languages. And let me know if this has happened to you. Regardless, it could be your heritage language or a language you're learning, where you just keep forgetting words. So there is in the context of heritage learners, there is a proficiency decline, as we said, due to the input and output, and the language shift. The primary language becomes secondary. The primary was the heritage language becomes secondary, and the secondary will become primary. And this is, for example, due to, of course, social integration. Imagine a family that moves to another country, and the parents they tend not to speak the language. So we have different scenarios, of course, different situations. However, I've had students who told me they feel frustrated. So students in their early 30s, for example, they feel frustrated or even mad at their parents for not teaching them their heritage language. So now they're adults. They realize they want to be able to speak this language, to understand the language of their ancestors, but they feel like it's getting more difficult for them because of no time, have no time, and less motivation, etc. However, I believe that we should never blame parents in any situation. This could happen out of well, fear, first of all, because oh, my child is not going to integrate in this society, so I need to teach them the dominant language, the language of the society first, and then of course it could be out of ignorance, out of, for example, not knowing how to raise bilingual children, because it's a whole science and art. It's something that is still being there. There's still studies about that, ongoing studies about this topic. The very term heritage speaker and heritage language was coined in 1989, so very recently. This doesn't mean that heritage languages did not exist as a phenomenon, or simply we saw heritage learners as just any bilingual learners. However, they have their own challenges, their own context, situation. So I have another question. Do you believe that being bilingual means that you know two languages perfectly? So what is a perfect acquisition for you? What is a perfect production or comprehension of a language? And do you believe that that you can know two languages perfectly? Is it 50-50, or is it 60%, 40%? Depends on, again, the input and output. And I would like to know, if you're a heritage speaker, do you feel like you know both of your languages perfectly? Do you feel like you can easily switch from one language to another in any context? Or you feel like there are certain contexts where you are more at ease using your dominant language, or maybe now your native language, and certain contexts, such as, I don't know, family gatherings, where you would use your heritage language. So yes, you all know this meme again. Do you know how smart I am in Spanish? Sometimes we would ask ourselves, well, what is a dominant language when we're talking about bilingualism? How do I know what is my dominant language? And sometimes we would ask ourselves, okay, what is the language I would use at work? What is the language I can write an email? I can be super formal, polite, or I can simply easily maintain a conversation. However, this could not really give you an answer, not always. Sometimes we can discover what is our dominant language if you grew up with two languages, is by asking yourself, what language do you use when you're feeling fear or anxiety? So we're talking about something that is you're in a dangerous situation. What is the first language that were when you would say a swear word, or you would express your fear? Then what language do you naturally make jokes in? You know how hard it can be to understand, to see the humor in a language, even if you're at an advanced level of learning, whether it's a heritage language or a language you're learning for fun. I have this, for example, I believe my Spanish level is quite high at the moment, but for example, I would watch some stand-up comedies, and I would struggle to understand some jokes because they have a lot of cultural references. I did not grow up in that environment, a lot of social references. So jokes are really C3 level. And then one, two, three, it was supposed to be three, sorry. What language do you count in? Have you noticed that I don't know, maybe learners who they already are at intermediate level. They do know their numbers, of course, in the language. However, when they need to quickly count or do some maths, or I don't know, figure out a price, something that is important, they would count in their native language or in their dominant language. So yes, this has more to do with emotions. The language you can express your emotions, the language you dream in, should be, or the languages you dream in. Sorry, and yes, just to clarify, I was raised only with one language, with Macedonian. So this is not my case. I'm just talking from a perspective of a teacher that has contact with this community, and that's why I discovered some common challenges. Well, something that I noticed. First of all, is of course the limited exposure. A family that migrated 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, they took the language from 50 years ago. We know that language evolves every year. We have some new things, a new slang, innovation, or something in the language. So a limited exposure is also sticking to this old archaic language, and not being in the country, not having a lot of contact with the culture, you don't necessarily consume a lot of new content, a lot of new media. You're not really fully immersed into this language. Again, I should not be generalizing. There are countless communities, heritage language communities. There could be a Spanish community that has a lot of input, a lot of content, and then from a perspective of a Macedonian, a very small community, there is less and less exposure. And then there is a code switching, something I will explain soon. And of course, the gaps in grammar or formal vocabulary, because we said the acquisition, language acquisition process was interrupted at an very early stage. So you know that code switching is switching between two or more languages or dialects within a conversation. You can see an example in Spanish. You have, for example, voy al mall para comprar ropa, and this especially happens with when you insert a verb or a noun from your dominant language into your heritage language. So you would use the original your heritage language phrase structure. In the case of Macedonian, it's a really interesting example because I will read this is in Cyrillic. You will just recognize store, and you see that it's store ot. So this ot is the article in Macedonian, which is postfixed. It's a suffix. So you see that the phrase structure is completely kept in Macedonian, is grammatically correct in Macedonian. However, the keyword, let's say in the conversation, the noun that you need to emphasize will be in your dominant language. So they would say otido vo storo, the store, this store, da kupam nešto. Same in Spanish. So we'll have situational code switching where you have separate languages for separate context. You will separate your dominant language only for work-related context, writing mails, or educational context, and then family gatherings and home. It's the heritage language, and then conversational again is to maintain flow when you don't remember when bilingualism happens. Bilingualism. So a code switching. In a code switching, we will keep one phrase structure in one language, but we will just insert words from a different language. However, a transfer is a different phenomenon that happens. Especially, we will have two type of transfer. We'll have a positive transfer, and this is if this interference transfer will help you speak a language through directly translating it from your language. An example is, let's say, a Spanish speaker will follow the Spanish word order, such as we'll have the subject, verb, and object when speaking English, which is the same. So that will help them. However, we'll have negative transfer or interference where one language, well, a language that has a separate or very different phrase structure or word order interferes in the language. Here we have a different situation. We'll have a situation where the dominant language, in this case English, will interfere in your heritage language. So what happens here is, let's say, well, let's take the English phrase, I live in Japan. In English, you absolutely need to use the personal pronouns because the verb conjugation will not indicate which person we're talking about. However, in languages like Spanish or Macedonian, mostly Roman Slavic languages except French, a lot of Slavic languages, this if you overuse the personal pronoun, is it's redundant because the very verb conjugation tells you which person we're talking about. It's vivo, so we know that it's yo vivo in Japon, and then žive am with this am ending. In Macedonian, you know that it's I live. So heritage speakers tend to overuse personal pronouns based on English. They would just translate directly from English. So, and this especially sounds unnatural when you have a whole paragraph or a speech and you keep repeating, yes, živem v Japonia, yes, rabotam v Japonia. So you keep repeating I, and it's really redundant. The same happens in Spanish. It's not grammatically incorrect, but it's not natural. Then we have a phrase such as I'm 25 years old in English, and then we would have an interference in Spanish. Some heritage speakers who interrupted their language acquisition process, they would keep saying soy 25 años, soy. They would use the to be verb instead to have, which is natural for these languages, for Spanish and Macedonian as well. Yasum should be yas imam, I have 25 years. And this is a very recurring. Maybe you can compare it with your language, because this is something that is really different in each language, whether it's to be or to have, to be of a certain age or to have years. And then, of course, adjective and adverb. In English, you can say, how are you? I'm good. I'm well, the adverb. However, if you translate this good as the adjective in Spanish or Macedonian, it will sound, well, it will not sound natural. Not necessarily incorrect, because if you say ja sum dobar in Macedonian, it just means I am good, as a good person. So it's an adjective describing. And same, you would use estoy bien, the adverb, instead of bueno. And then we have, for example, the use of article. I'm a student. We'll have in Spanish soy una estudiante. Well, Spanish does have the article. However, it sounds unnatural. So sometimes it's not a matter of grammatically correct or not. It's how natural it sounds. And then this again has to do with the quantity, the quality of input received. So we'll have soy un estudiante rather than soy estudiante, or again in Macedonian, ja sum eden student is like saying I'm one student. So it's not natural. Then we have something that is a typical interference from English to Macedonian. It's the double negation. Double negation is completely unnatural in English, not correct. So it's I never eat meat. However, Macedonian and Slavic languages tend to have double negation. We really like our negation, so we will really exaggerate. We would say I never don't eat meat, if you want to see how it sounds, for example, or how it might sound to a heritage language that has English as primary language. So they would say nikogash, never, jadam meso, eat meat. However, what we need to say is nikogash ne, I never, do not, jadam meso. And this is a very typical example of interference. Then the use of preposition, of course. A preposition is something that whenever you learn a language, whatever motivation you have to learn a language, it's the prepositions are usually some of the most complicated features of a language. So we have I'm at home, for example, in English, or at home, preposition at. However, in Macedonian, it's jas sum doma, home. We would not say, a heritage speaker tends to say jas sum vo doma, because they would translate directly. So the interference is a result of translating. So jas sum vo doma, using the preposition, is not correct, because this is a remnant of a case, even though Macedonian has no cases. And we have an example. We previously had an example of English being the dominant language. Now we have an example of Spanish being the dominant language and Macedonian heritage language. And again, it's all about the structure, natural structure. In Spanish, you would say tengo hambre. You would use the phrase I have hunger to say I'm hungry. In Macedonian, it's rather the English structure. So you would use the verb to be. I am hungry. So imam. Some heritage speakers, they would say imam glad. Well, this happens not only with Spanish. I've had contact with less Spanish speakers that learn Macedonian. I had, for example, contact with German speakers. German speakers, they also tend to tend to form the phrase like this based on German. So they would use to have like imam and then glad, the noun, hambre, hunger, even though it's glad, and sum is the verb to be. I have another question for you. So you feel free to write your answers, or a question, or your story, maybe, if you recognized some patterns, so feel free to write it in the comments. Can you think of a moment where you or someone you know used a transfer or code switching while speaking multiple languages, 2 languages, for example, or more? Do you think it was because the languages were similar, close enough? Do you think it was based on the situation? There was a switch of context of the situation changed. So I don't know. For example, you switched your you went from a workspace to a family gathering. If you can send some anecdotes, we would love to hear that. Now, when we talk about teaching strategy, it's important to understand, of course, the heritage language profile, and it's important to know that each profile is unique. We would have certain tendencies, but the heritage language acquisition will depend on various factors, such as biological factors, such as age, at what age the language acquisition was interrupted, if it was interrupted. Maybe it was not. There are very strong communities with the strong language practice that are tied to culture, or even religion, for example, that keep their language because it's tied to a culture. And then it's very important to understand what the challenges are. We saw that some of the challenges are code switching, false friends, of course. Then there are and other linguistic challenges, such as really depends on the language you teach or the language you're learning. However, I would like to share something that I noticed in Macedonian that I believe it happens in Spanish, for example, or Portuguese, Latin languages, but that have the same some of these linguistic features, such as the use of diminutive. The form which you would use to convey something small or affectionate. So, because heritage speakers, many of them, interrupted their language acquisition when they were kids, the input they received, the language, was with a lot of diminutive use, because that's how we would talk to children. So we would say, wash your little hands, right? Arachinya in Macedonian instead of race. And what happens is, because this acquisition was interrupted, They still have this vocab and they still use this vocab even though they're adults. So you would hear a heritage speaker saying, "I will wash my little hands," even though they're adults. Again, this really depends on when they stop learning, if they stop learning, etc. You will see some grammatical gaps, such as underdeveloped use of past tenses. If a language has a lot of past tenses, they would stick to one or two. This especially happens in Macedonian because it's a language that, like English, has a lot of past tenses, such as past perfect, past simple, and then we even have a past tense where it depends whether you witness the action or not, whether it's reported speech. This is one of the tense where we hear a lot of mistakes. So this is what you need to focus on also when teaching. You need to create a language rich environment, a lot of input, update your students with a list of resources they can use of modern language, of course. So modern podcasts, modern maybe it depends, of course, on their interests, but magazines, so that they are updated with what happens in society and how language changes and evolves. Because some of them might have restricted use of content in this language. Allow mistakes, of course, with correcting them afterwards, and focus on natural communication, the way you would teach well, a native speaker. And then when it comes to literacy, it's important to be careful here because as heritage speakers did not have a formal education in this language, so they would not know a metalinguistic language such as noun or even a verb. How you say noun or how you say verb in this language, or how do you say vowel, consonant, as things that might sound simple. So not even introducing these terms is perhaps one of the best strategies, at least at the beginning. And then teaching literacy step by step, especially if the alphabet is different of the heritage language. Might be Korean, might be Macedonian, so a language with a different alphabet. Of course, speech will be number one. So the most important thing is to be able to speak and understand, and then literacy and the alphabet comes as a whole new level. And of course, culture and identity. It's really important because what motivates these learners is their ties to the culture, to identity. Well, I have, for example, a story we'll take a student example who grew up hearing Macedonian, however, had a very limited output practice, so very limited speaking practice. And then, for example, in this area of studies, we tend to call these learners overhearers, so someone that overheard the language. They might have grown up hearing a lot of the language, or however, they had very few circumstances where they actually practiced it. And then, for example, when it comes to language adoption, the heritage language that they adopted might be also archaic because it depends on when their family migrated or moved to another country. As I said, many people who migrated, at least in my according to my experiences, they would just take the older language. So now we have a new updated language, and whenever they would try to hear some modern media, modern content, they would struggle with comprehension, even more with production. I've definitely noticed a lot of code switching, a lot of tense struggles, but a lot of aha moments as well. So when there is a passive knowledge, so they would say, "Oh, I knew that word." So what is the strategy? The strategy is, of course, to to keep exposing them with to a lot of content, so a lot of input, but then also encouraging them to speak. And some of these speakers would also, as I said, they would feel maybe frustrated or embarrassed to make mistakes. That's why it's very important to create a fun, engaging, interactive learning activity. And to be aware of these challenges so that you know what to focus on. This will depend on the language you teach, of course, and the language, the heritage learners' goals. So you'll have different goals, such as a very specific target. Oh, I'm planning a trip to my ancestral home, and I really want to be able to speak fluently with my relatives. Or I want to reconnect with my grandparents. I want to hear them speak their language. Or I want to understand my cultural heritage, my folklore. I want to support my children in learning our heritage language. So you'll have a lot of goals that will also determine your way of teaching. Well, thank you so much, gracias and Paula. We have a couple of questions and limited time. Um, so I speak Bavarian at home with my parents. Nice. That's really, it's really cool that you keep your language. And we have another comment. Mexican. My wife is Japanese. We live in Japan. My kids both speak Japanese better. Yes, it will always depend on the language you use and the input, and especially there are many strategies. For example, encouraging parents to stick to their heritage language, even because the kid will naturally acquire the dominant language. So not speaking the heritage language would be a mistake because there will be no other way for the kid to learn. Or that could happen afterwards as an adult. But as I said, some heritage speakers really feel frustrated for not having learned the language in their early childhood. My daughter, both were born in Mexico. My son until he was 4. My daughter only 4 months. Then we came to Japan. So my daughter has zero idea of anything else but Japanese. Yes, yes, it's an example of how you would switch environments, and then in this case, it's really important to have your priorities. What is the language you want to your children to speak? Would you like to support them to help them in their process of learning? I see code switching in Ukrainian community here in Poland. They use Polish nouns in the conversation, for example, in academical context. Yes, and especially in academical context, that would be a very advanced level of the language. This happens especially with common closed languages such as Ukrainian, Polish. It definitely happens. I know examples of Macedonian, Serbian. I can think of that, where we would have a lot of code switching, but also interference, because even though they're closed languages, the verbal systems are different. So Serbian has cases, Macedonian doesn't have cases. So a lot of interference will happen here. Do heritage speakers often have an accent, foreign sounding accent in their heritage language? Again, it really, really depends on the how long have they for how long have they kept the language. You can hear a heritage language that has zero accent or very little accent, or and then you will hear a heritage language that will really struggle to form a basic phrase. So a pronunciation is definitely something that is impacted by the dominant language. It seems that Macedonian has way much loanwords in comparison to other Slavic languages. Tell me your opinion about Andrijana Tisina i Dobrofala. That's Matthias. Hi, Mati. So yes, well, loanwords depends. Loanwords from a lot of languages. It depends really on the category. Well, we have a lot of German loanwords for when it comes to cars, loanwords. German language or loanwords when it comes to cars, French loanwords, and Italian when it comes to fashion and cosmetics. It really depends, but yes, of course, we do have a lot. Turkish, not even how many Turkish words we have. Is there a difference between a heritage speaker and a bilingual speaker? Yes, a heritage speaker is a speaker who literally grew up with this language. Well, in most of the cases. Imagine it's the language you heard your lullabies in this language, or the language that you heard people around you speaking, and when you were a baby and when you were a child. Unlike a second language learner who starts from scratch, who might sound from scratch. So the exposure of the language, the early exposure of the language is different. That might happen later on during lessons with these aha moments when I what I said will which will not happen with the second language learners who start from scratch. So much language, not just vocabulary, is learned in school and through your life experience. If you speak a language mostly at home or in a relatively limited circumstances, including work or reading, how are the languages going to be equal? Can anyone duplicate the breadth and depth of their education and life experience in each language? And you mentioned the importance of social cultural understanding. Yes, it really depends on the environment, because there will be many factors such as the national policies of a country. Are language communities supported? Can language communities have their education in their language? There are a lot of, and as you said, you cannot have two experiences in your life. So you will definitely have end up having a lot of input, different input, depending on the context, whether it's work or school. But the idea is, if you want to really reconnect to your roots and relearn your heritage language, it is possible. It is absolutely possible to expose yourself completely to the language you once spoke or your ancestors once spoke. This is very interesting for the Esperanto community. There are many families who use Esperanto, usually international families. The parents speak with their kids in their mother languages. Usually, each parent has his or her own mother language. Between them, the parents speak Esperanto's common language of the couple family. The kids also speak the native language of the country where they live. Amazing topic. Yeah, well, Esperanto is a it's a really nice it's a really cool example, because it will because you, they would keep, of course, their languages, but then they have another language that they practice. So that's a perfect example. I once was sitting in a pub in an Alsatian village, and there was a group of local youth switching all the time between French and their local German dialect. Oh, well, that's good to hear, because I lived in France, but I rarely heard minority languages. So I'm really happy to hear about that. Cool. I don't know if there are other questions. Um, that's it. Okay. Well, thank you so much for participating, for your presence, and I hope it was interesting. It's a really fun topic. I personally really like it, and I am convinced this is not just any kind of bilingualism. And then I told you that it's a very recent area of study. It was recently developed in the 80s, as a case study. It was just linked to bilingualism before that, and that was it. But now it's a whole new area of study, and it's something that is very relevant nowadays, because there is more and more multilingualism, multiculturalism. So yes, it's a multicultural world, and it's a very important topic. Well, thank you so much. I think this is it, and yes, we'll see you soon, hopefully in the next edition of the Polyglot Gathering. See ya. Bye.